Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 11th webinar of the 60 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence webinar series hosted by the International Youth Alliance for Peace under the theme of Empowering Voices, Ending Violence Against Women with a focus on gender and addressing gender-based violence in 2024. I'm Inoka Korituakku, and it is my pleasure to be the moderator for today's session. At IYAP, we always believe that knowledge is the foundation of meaningful change guiding all our initiatives. So, today's webinar will focus on addressing gender-based violence in conflict and crisis zones. It is our honor to introduce Dr. Anuradha Rodrigo to take us through today's session. Dr. Anuradha Rodrigo holds a PhD in Peace and Conflict Studies and currently serves as a senior lecturer in Conflict and Peace Studies at the University of Colombo. In addition to her academic role, Dr. Rodrigo is a dedicated social science researcher, research analyst, and consultant specializing in peace and conflict studies. Her extensive expertise and diverse professional engagements makes her a valuable voice in the field. So, before we begin, I would like to inform our participants that the chat will remain closed during the presentation. Once the presentation concludes, the chat will reopen for an open discussion where you can share your thoughts and ask any questions. At the same time, I would like to inform our participants that to recognize your dedication to the program, certificate will be awarded to those with at least 80% participation and who completes the feedback form based on attendance tracking. So I'm pleased now to hand over the floor to Dr. Anuradha, who will be leading us in today's session. Over to you, Dr. Anuradha.
Thank you so much, Ms. Inoka. You asked me to not to call you Miss, at least for now. Yes, good evening, everyone. Thank you, International Youth Alliance for Peace, for inviting me for this webinar. At the same time, thank you so much for your generous introduction. So let me start by sharing my document. Yes, I hope it's clear for you all.
Yes, we can see the presentation. If you can put it into the presenting mode. Fine.
Right. I was asked to discuss gender-based violence in conflict and crisis area. For me, it is a very comprehensive and which leads to a huge wide spectrum, so which cannot be done within half an hour. So I decided to, as a result, talk about it within 3 parameters. So in which I would like to first conceptualize the gender-based violence in crisis and conflict zones. I wish to do that because it's not something new that we are encountering in the 20th or the 21st century. It's been there ever since human evolution. I always say that conflict, war, and violence has been there ever since human evolution. It's not something that we can completely eliminate from the human history or even in the contemporary situations. So as a result, I would like to show you the distinction between the gender-based violence that we are encountering in the 21st century and how it was different, how it has taken to a different level as a result of certain changing circumstances, particularly changing nature of conflict and war. So this is why I'm taking a conceptual analysis in order to make you convince how the gender-based violence in crisis and conflict zones occurs right now in the world. While doing so, I will be narrating my presentation to the next segment, which is I would like to relate and sort of connect it with the human nature, because I always believe that when it comes to conflict war, disputes, and violence have a direct connection to human nature. So let me first, while doing so, while conceptualizing the gender-based violence in conflict and crisis situations, I would also showing you the direct relation between the human nature, conflict, and violence, how it is interrelated, how it is interconnected, and how it is interdependent as such. While doing so only, we can identify to a great extent the root causes behind it in order to sort of eliminate such a violent situations. Finally, I would like to explore mechanism to curtail the ongoing issues. It's just I'm emphasizing again, it has to be mechanisms, because we cannot think about strategies as such, because if you are to, then you have to think about eliminating or preventing conflicts right now. So let's look at in a more taking a different approach, exploring mechanism to curtail the ongoing issues, especially looking at the context specific issues, how we can sort of bring in certain mechanisms and strategies, at least to some extent, to curtail it and to take it over to a better situation. Right. Before I start my presentation, I would like to pose a question to my audience who are here. That is, do you believe that violence, aggression, and vulgarity is innate in humans? Anyone? No? Should I then continue? Is there's no one is going to answer that question? Do you believe that violence, aggression, and vulgarity is innate in humans? Okay. Right. The Western understanding is different to Eastern understanding. Western discourses and Western thinking is entirely different to most of the Eastern discourses that we have not given so much prominence to. However, based on my research findings related to my PhD, at the same time, I'm someone who doesn't ardently believe in Western ideas. Instead, I grew up with it. I know there's so much prominence given to this, which is accurate, but then again, like, it is an era that we have to sort of deconstruct these Western ideologies, Western thinking to a great extent, or else we have to decolonize that, in my point of view. So based on my experience and my research and my reading, I would like to narrate it as humans are not inherently violent. Yet traits like violence, vulgarity, and aggression, as well as opposite traits such as generosity and benevolence and compassion, all these are embedded in you and me as well. Everybody, in every human being, it is there. But the difference is not that every time it triggers you to act violently, act aggressively, or even to act compassionately in a benevolent manner. So these qualities are triggered based on the circumstances. This is something that we have to understand thoroughly in the current context. So when humans enter into disputes, conflicts, and violence, which is, as I mentioned very clearly, which has been a part and parcel of human evolution. Ever since human evolution, we have encountered different style of dispute, different conflicts, different violence, different wars. It's only that it has erupted at different levels and different momentum in different definitions and names. That's all. But whenever humans enter into such kind of disputes and a conflict, they try to destroy their opponent some way or the other and to claim victory. It is something very natural in every war and conflict scenarios. In such situations, they are driven by immense hatred. You have to understand, before a human entering into that kind of a catastrophic issues, entering into conflict or a dispute, their mentality is different to after they enter into that. Okay, that's a great distinction. I hope you can resonate with that, despite you not having a experience. So the situation is they are driven by immense hatred, delusion. Once they enter into a conflict, at the same time, they always wish to destroy their opponent and claim victory. So whether it's two parties or many parties, finally what happens is they try to achieve their ultimate goal of victory by destroying their opponent some way or the other. So for this, their mentality largely supports this delusion, the hatred largely support. So this is where that you see the human behavior going to a level of violent and inhuman behavior, which is entirely different to a peaceful situation. If you look at, we boast about that we have not encountered a third world war, which is true, which is a great achievement. But then again, if you look at the contemporary world situation, right now what we are encountering, there are 43 active conflicts in the world, in which 15 in the Middle East and the North Africa, 14 in Sub-Saharan Africa, 9 in Asia, 4 in Europe, and 1 in Latin America. So this shows that even though that we boast about that we have not encountered a third world war, we are in a enormous catastrophic and difficult situation. In all these 43 active conflicts, there are active conflicts, there are interstate conflicts, there are intrastate conflicts. At the same time, there are internationalized intrastate conflicts. In every context, right now, we are encountering, majority of the people are encountering this gender-based violence, which is very inhuman activity. So while I'm trying to conceptualize in such a way, as I mentioned, I did not put that into my PowerPoint slides, but especially after 1990, you are seeing a distinct difference in the changing nature of conflict, changing nature of war, compared to what it was in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and the 19th century. So this was rightly identified by give me 1 minute. Porto in 2013, where he defines the emergence of the New World Order with the collapse of Russia as causing a fundamental shift in the analysis of war and armed conflict. It is shifting a shift that permeated all disciplines, focusing on this most destructive of human activities. He further adds, academia and policymaking cycles in the West were largely unprepared for the task of explaining such societal conflicts. So when I said that when you're looking at the conflict and the crisis situations in the contemporary world is entirely different to what it was in prior to 19th century. So when you're looking at the gender-based violence in the same contemporary and crisis zones, sort of again different to what the gender-based violence that they have encountered prior to the 19th century. So this context has to be identified. So it has evolved in such a way and leading it to a very complex scenario, making us very difficult to find out the root causes behind it and finding new mechanism to curtail or to eliminate it completely. So when I'm looking at it conceptually, I would like to again emphasize the changing nature of war and conflicts, which has also made an impact on the gender-based violence, as I mentioned earlier. So this has led to a in any situation, whether it's interstate or intrastate or internationalized intrastates, in every context, it's very obvious when there's a conflict and a crisis is going on, there's unequal power dynamics, and which is leading to breakdown of social structures. And also it has led to shift in societal norms. So in any crisis and conflict and a war situation, you don't find laws, you don't find societal norms, you don't find moral principles as such. It's very common. So in such a situation, like it is where that people become extremely vulnerable. Yeah, because you hardly know what is going to happen in the next few seconds. So in a conflict and a crisis scenario, stress can be heightened as a result, which is it is part and parcel of human nature. When you know that you're in a vulnerable situation, it's a life and death situation, stress definitely can be heightened. So is the fear. It is also part of the human nature. And it also loses control. You're not going to be mindful. You don't know what you're going to do next time, in the next few seconds. So this leads individuals to exhibit aggressive or violent behaviors. Sometimes people can be very violent, very aggressive, or extremely vulnerable. So this is what I always say, that people are diverse in nature. They're different one another. So the way they perceive things, the external stimuli, the circumstances is also as a result different from one another. So when there can be aggressive lot in a conflict and a crisis situation, there can also be a violent lot in the conflict and a crisis situation. At the same time, there can be a very vulnerable lot as well. Therefore, for some, violence becomes a means of asserting dominance. They take it as a situation where they can show their identity, where they can show their domination and dictate terms and so on and so forth. On the other hand, for some, it is a matter of coping with psychological stress. Yeah, so you have to identify all these groups when you are looking at a crisis situation and how it is impacting the gender-based violence as well. So it is a very, very complex situation. I hope you understand that. So I'm now coming to what is gender-based violence is all about. So let me put it in this way. It's a very harmful, inhuman acts deliberately directing at individual based on their gender, psychological and economic violence, which disproportionately targeting women and girls. So this targeting women and girls were the most common scenarios prior to 19th century. You hardly seen, it doesn't mean that they never targeted boys, they never targeted males. They did. But compared to today's world, it was less, very less. So also in the contemporary 21st century, in this intrastate and internationalized intrastate violence, you also see they also target marginalized genders, including a LGBTQ community. So this increased recognition of male-directed sexual violence and the impact on LGBTQ individuals in conflict zones demonstrates the evolving gender violence. So this evolution is happening in parallel with changing nature of conflict, changing nature of war and disputes, which is also a changing nature of human behavior. As a result, sexualized violence against civilians has become a very common form of human rights violations in the many conflicts and crisis situations, especially aftermath of the Cold War. This is what Porter mentioned very rightly. So it's not only the 1990 brought a new international world order, but also starting with the nature of international politics and the international system, that also changed the nature of war and conflict as well, which made an impact on the human behavior, which made an impact on the gender-based violence as well. So this is where that you see rape becoming a systematic tool, a weapon of warfare, aiming to torture and humiliate the victims and their families to destroy the fabric of the community and demoralize the enemy. But even in the 17th and the 15th to 17th, 18th centuries, there were wars which fought for 30 years, 80 years, even Napoleon wars. Even then, these wars were fought within a certain jurisdiction. They sort of like surrendered to their violence, they adhere to certain social norms and regulations. But you don't see it now, even though that we boast about that we are living in the 21st century, advanced humanity, we have developed in technologically, scientifically, but it also shows the moral decline of human nature. It's very obvious. So this is why they have taken rape as a systematic weapon of warfare with the aim to torture and humiliate the victims and their families, to destroy the fabric of the community, to demoralize the enemy. And that's a very easy way of doing it. You don't have to invest so much on weapons. You don't have to invest so much on other mechanisms. Yeah. So Geneva Conventions implicitly recognized rape as a war crime, but the use of sexual violence as a weapon of war often went unacknowledged at that time. That was not a time that people wanted to disclose what they went through as a result of aiming gender-based violence. But this was more significant. This came into being as a public rhetoric and academic rhetoric, and where we started to talk about and finding ways and means to overcome it, especially after 1990. Starting from the United Nations organizations and the Secretary General and many other non-governmental organizations, they start to talk about finding ways and means to sort of curtail it, at least to overcome it, at least to find ways and means to protect these victims. And this is especially after the Rwandan and the Balkan genocide that occurred in 1990, that rape was explicitly recognized as a weapon of war and a crime against humanity by international courts, such as the ICTR and the ICTY. Now you will wonder why I'm bringing in Thomas Hobbes to this. I don't know, I felt that I have to bring it here. I hope that some of y'all have heard Thomas Hobbes and Rousseau. He's a Western thinker, but the state of nature that he speaks about on his great treatise Leviathan is called the state of nature as a hypothetical condition in which human beings lived before creation of the organized societies and governments. Why I try to broach Thomas Hobbes' idea of state of nature here, when you look at the contemporary violent and the crisis scenarios, all these 43 intrastate to internationalized intrastate and interstate conflicts that we are encountering today, you take all of that, it's very obvious, all that context, every person in that context experience nothing but a state of nature. Forget about all that 43 conflicts. Take at least the Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon and Iran. Take at least Ukraine and Russia. Even those two contexts is very easily you can identify the similar to a state of nature, which defined by Hobbes, that it's where the human lived in a lawless society. There were no laws, there were no regulation, there were no social norms, there were no moral principles to guide them. So it was an uncivilized situation this is one period of, one context of human evolution this occurred. And this compelled human beings to collectively come and surrender themselves to enter into a sort of a organized society, organized government, to appoint a leader, to set up regulations and to set up hierarchies to regulate human behavior and to punish the people who misbehave, so on and so on. But in even the 21st century, this is why that there's no, whether it is 19th to 21st century, there's no much of a difference when it comes to crisis and conflict scenarios in that context. So it's a state, there were no laws, no authority, and no formal institutions to regulate human behavior. So individuals acted slowly based on their own self-interest and instincts, leading to inevitable conflict. So he further elaborates this. I'm also taking 3 fundamental features of the state of nature in order for you to relate to the same context that majority of the war-torn crisis situation is going through the same. There's constant insecurity because there's no laws, there's no central authority. As I mentioned earlier, people would compete for resources such as food, shelter, and security. This is what's actually happening right now in the conflict and the crisis situation. And also conflict and violence pervasively Continuing, driven by the desire for self-preservation, distrust of others, hatred, individuals would constantly fight to defend themselves or dominate others. So this is a very miserable conditions, but I'm here using exactly the words that used by Thomas Hobbes in his State of Nature, where he defined it as a situation, the war of all against all. For me, what we are encountering in the 21st century is also something similar to that. It's true, it's only 43 countries are going through this war of all against all, but then again, it doesn't mean all the other countries are living peacefully. It is more of, as Joanne Galton says, it's a structural violence scenario. So, however, Hobbes had a very pessimistic attitude of human nature, where he famously stated that the life in this state of nature would be every human is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, and cruel. So this is exactly that you can see even in the contemporary conflict scenarios. I'm taking that situation to genocide and sexual violence, which have prevailed, particularly starting from 1990. I'm taking from 1990. That is because it's massive and it is so inhuman, and it is not something that we can acceptable in the 20th to 21st century. In Rwanda, 250,000 to 500 women were raped in the Rwandan genocide. In the former Yugoslavia, between 1992 to 1995, approximately 60,000 women subjected to sexual violence. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, at least 200,000 women raped in ongoing violence. 1,100 women raped monthly, with an average of 36 women and girls daily. So it's only raped. Yeah. So if you look at the other forms of abuse, which includes in all of these cases, not only rape, there are sexual slavery, there's arbitrary execution, there's torture, there's forced prostitution, there's also genital mutilations. This is what I said, that there are certain forms of abuse is different to what we have encountered prior to the 19th century. It has deteriorated to a very aggressive, inhuman, and a very violent behavior. And in terms of numbers, it has increased. And in terms of aiming the gender is not only confining to women and girls, but also there are 15% of males. Even DRC, they have found out 15% of boys and males were also targeted for these inhuman activities currently. So it shows that these forms of abuse include not only rape in this violent and crisis situation, it has gone to another level of sexual slavery and human trafficking, arbitrary execution, torture, forced prostitution, and genital mutilations. In the case of the contemporary Israel-Palestine conflict, we don't have much of data, but 70% of the casualties, this is very different. This is not, I'm talking about in the context of Israel-Palestine. It is about the casualties in Gaza are 70% are women and children. And sexual violence is a major concern, especially for those detained or held hostage. And on the other hand, ongoing investigation into allegation of sexual violence by both Hamas and Israel forces, highlighting the weaponization of rape and abuse, is very evident. On the other hand, Ukraine conflict reports document systematic sexual violence by Russian forces. Victims include individuals of all genders and ages, So that is also a distinction that you see in the contemporary violent and crisis situation. At the same time, Ukrainian prosecutors are pursuing these acts as war crimes. In Mali and Sahel regions, following withdrawal of this is a different situation. This is like aftermath of conflict, where they were trying to build peace. Yeah. So after the peacemaking and the peace building, they are withdrawing the peacekeepers. Armed groups have exploited the security vacuum. Gender-based violence, including rape and trafficking, has significantly escalated ever since. In the case of Iran, suppression of women-led protests under Women Life Freedom movement involves harassment, sexual violence, and politically motivated abuse. State actors use extensive surveillance to target women. So I'm talking about the current ongoing conflicts. So refugees and displaced population. So it is not confining to crisis situations alone, conflict situation alone. So when it comes to refugees and displaced population, they are also encountering the same scenarios, all inhuman activities. 1 in 5 women in humanitarian emergencies experiences sexual violence. This figure underscores the heightened vulnerability of women and girls in camps and conflict zones globally. So don't you think all these situations are similar to what once Hobbes mentioned? It's a state of nature. So let me come into now. I hope that you understood clearly the fact that the changing nature of conflict, how it has led to a very complex, protracted, deep-rooted conflict situations, deteriorating human conditions and deteriorating human motives, and also where even that we are living in a very advanced sort of environment, technologically, scientifically, morally, politically, and economically. This changing circumstances always can make human to act inhumanly, aggressively, and violently. So this is why that it is widely recognized that women are often disproportionately affected as victims in conflict. But it's very sad when you look at it. I mean, we are in an advanced world that how it narrates. Yeah, this narrative reflects a gender binary. This is something that when I was reading through, which I identified clearly, even though that we speak about 21st century, we speak about civilizations, we speak about feminism. It's true that feminist scholars, their scholarly contribution to this area it's very significant. They have done quite a lot, but then again, what is lacking right now? It's this narration reflects a very obvious gender binary that perpetuated in the many resolutions, many policies, and legal frameworks. It's very sad. I think the very reason we're still hanging on to this old notion that the male gender is the most prominent, the strong, they are the soldiers, they are the peacemakers and the builders who can take a country from to a victory and so on and so forth. That's how the perception still continues. On the other hand, women are largely being recognized as civilians, vulnerable lot, and victims. So this gender binary is also evident not only in the conflict and the crisis situation, even in the policy resolutions and the legal frameworks, sadly. So when you're talking about the mechanism, this situation has to be looked at largely. So this binary overlooks the complex roles of women play in conflict. It's not that women also can have a significant role in the conflict and the crisis situation, which that fact is completely excluded from our imagination. Yeah, we don't believe as a result. It including as combatants, peace builders, even leaders, as well as the vulnerabilities men and boys may face, can be overcome to some extent by women, the involvement as well. So modern conflicts, as I mentioned, often involve the 21st century conflicts is, as I started, that the nature of conflicts and war has changed largely. This involved not only the guerrilla groups and the government, there are so many other stakeholders to the modern conflict as well. That is also another factor why it has become very protracted and deep-rooted and complex. And that's how it is impacting on the gender-based violence as well. It includes non-state actors, asymmetric warfare, leading to widespread systematic sexual violence against women, men, and children. Let me take an example from Ethiopia, which I always take with my students. If you take Ethiopian context right now, after the birth of Eritrea, currently Ethiopian government is fighting against 8 guerrilla groups, out of which 3 are fighting against the government for a separate state based on self-determination right. Other 5 are fighting against the government to change the government. So imagine it's not like the situation that we encountered. I grew up with war in Sri Lanka, North and East. But then it was very evident. It was a war between Sri Lankan government and the LTTE. And we were able to identify who were the perpetrators, who were the combatants, who were the victims, who raped. I could remember, especially when Indian peacekeeping forces came, there was a huge argument based on, after the intervention of the peacekeepers, how Tamils and the Sinhala women and girls were raped by these peacekeepers. So you can identify this from whom it had happened. But in a case of Ethiopia, when there are 8 guerrilla groups supported by many other stakeholders, including non-state actors and diaspora, you can imagine the complicity in that violence and the conflict situation. That complicity also, that comprehensive nature also impact human behavior, also impact the violence aiming gender. So this is why I said that when you are looking at this has been there ever since human evolution, but it is no longer the same in the contemporary scenarios. So despite the progress in policy and the legal frameworks, implementation, there are gaps remains. It's very obvious. And sexual violence continues to be used as a tool of war, and it is very evident that is happening in the most advanced time in the history of humanity. In ongoing conflicts like those in Ukraine, Ethiopia, and Myanmar is very good examples for that. So with that note, let me come to the current frameworks of international legal framework and the international attention. But when you were listening to, you must have felt that nothing's being done by the international law, international humanitarian law, and the United Nations and everything. Of course, they have played a pivotal role in bringing gender-based violence to the forefront of the international policy. One good example is 2008 United Nations Security Council Resolution 1820 explicitly recognized sexual violence in conflicts as a tactic of war requiring a security response. Security General's initiatives, UN Secretary General Regulatory, highlights sexual violence in conflicts as a priority, so on and so forth. So I'm not going to go into so much detail since I've realized that I have gone beyond my given time. But what I'm trying to show you is that, there were legal frameworks, there were policy implementation, there were vociferous arguments supporting these victims and finding ways and means to overcome these atrocities. But then again, what we have to see in these contemporary scenarios, there's a obvious gap. At the same time, when you address these policies and policy initiatives and the legal framework, there's an imbalance. There has been a growing call to adopt a more nuanced and inclusive understanding of gender roles in conflict. That is one thing. recognizing the diverse experience of all individuals, irrespective of gender. This has to be looked at largely, which we have entirely. This is what I mentioned, that as long as we entangle in this gender binary attitude, it is not easy for us to find a solution with that. On the other hand, I believe that especially with the challenges that we are facing in the 21st century, not only war and conflict and violence and gender-related violence, but also many other economic situations and climate situation, we can find solution by initiating one certain or giving prominence to one discipline. I feel that we have to take a holistic approach. It has to be a combination of medical, biological sciences, mechanical engineering, social sciences, and other legal disciplines. So for an example, if you take rape, which can have a severe consequences for women's health, ranging from HIV/AIDS to infections to incontinence, from fistula to infertility, inflicting lasting suffering and fear to live with HIV/AIDS. Many victims are deeply traumatized as a result of rape and face rejection, not only from the community they are living with, even from their own family members. Stigmatization by their families and communities, a widespread issue that we are encountering right now. Same goes for children born after rape. They are excluded by their own mothers sometimes, even social groups, and for their mothers, it is difficult to care for them with love. Also, the economic life of this entire family is disrupted. Mentally, they are disrupted and traumatized, especially if women are the main breadwinner in the family. Thereafter, their capacity to work in the fields may be severely reduced due to physical and mental vulnerabilities. And daily tasks such as fetching water and wood are often avoided out of fear of further attacks. So as the violence affects all dimensions of a person's and her life, any type of a gender-based violence, it shows, it's very evident, it affects all dimensions of persons and her life. Protection strategies must take into consideration medical and psychological as well as legal and economic needs of survivors. And any response must take into consideration the causes of the violence, that is always a combination of war strategy and the subordinate position of women. Therefore, humanitarian interventions are to be linked to long-term empowerment strategies that strengthen gender equality and respect women as active agents in the rebuilding of their communities. With that note, I prefer to conclude since I have taken more than the given time. Yes. Thank you very much. And I hope you did understand the way I narrated my presentation. It is little haphazard perhaps, but what I wanted to convince you how different it is to what it was earlier and to what extent it has aggravated. As a result, finding solutions and mechanism is also difficult. And I hope that you understood that. I'm now happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anuradha, for sharing your valuable insights on today's topic, addressing gender-based violence in conflict and crisis zones, where you conceptually defined gender-based violence in such settings, and you have identified its root causes, and as well as you explored mechanism to address the ongoing challenges as well. What I felt was like, even though we are living in a very technologically very advanced setup, the statistics and the facts you have mentioned, it's quite alarming as well as it's so pathetic. So anyway, we have prepared a few questions for you as well to get some of more insights regarding this topic. So first of all, I would like to ask you, Dr. Anuradha, Can you share some examples of such grassroots or community-driven initiatives that have helped reduce gender-based violence in conflict or crisis areas?
Right. Thanks, Anamka. It's a very good question. But then again, do you still see me? You see,
Yes.
right, you see me clearly, right? Right. Because I stopped sharing my PowerPoint. Is that all right for y'all?
Yeah, that's fine.
Right. Such situations, it's like this, that before I directly answer your questions, let me put it in this way. I have a feeling that when it comes to starting from finding mechanisms and strategies, even though these are common scenarios and the victimization and the aftermath of these violent rape activities, what we all go through is similar. I still feel in certain instances that you have to sort of set up mechanisms and strategies which is more suitable to that situation. It has to be very context specific. So in common context, what we say is tailor-made ones. Yeah, it is. Again, I'm emphasizing the crisis. In a crisis situation, whatever the ethnicity or whatever the human gender is going through is pretty much similar. And the aftermath, the post crisis and the post violence scenarios are pretty much again similar. But still, when you are sort of like drafting mechanism to curtail these instances and also to overcome and also to bring in sort of a lasting peace to these victimized people, it has to be done by looking at the context that they have encountered in every, because I feel that in certain scenarios it is very unique and it's very different. For an example, when I was reading, I something that I found out, especially in the case of Africa, it is not a situation that where we can easily find a very developed and good mechanism as such, which they have taken from the grassroots rebel. Rwandan and the Bosnian question is where that 200 to 250,000 women were raped, but at the same time, they aftermath of this situation, they fostered a grassroots leadership by training women to advocate for their rights within their communities. So that is something that they started after they going through the situation. You see that it is very primitive in my point of view. It is very rudimentary in my point of view. It is something, this is where that, to bring in a sort of a mechanism. What you are trying to do is in the contemporary context, you bring in other either United Nations organizations or other non-governmental organizations or other mediators to find mechanism for these people, for this country. But I believe that it has to be developed by themselves. This is what I meant by context specific mechanism. So otherwise we are again, this is where that I believe largely that we have to be decolonized. Yeah, we have to be deconstruct certain Western mechanism we still being entangled into. I largely believe that. So this is very popular in Rwanda and Bosnia Herzegovina, especially after they were being raped and violently attacked, aiming their gender. So they wanted to survivors to rebuild their lives through skills, training, financial independence, and collective healing, which was support was given by many NGOs and the UN with the intervention of the many UN mechanism. At the same time, they set up a grassroots level leadership by training women to advocate for their rights and within their communities. So it is one example which I don't find very effective, to tell you the truth, Ka. So this is what I said, that we are still, this has to be deconstruct and we have to sort of decolonize. We are still sort of supported by largely colonial mentality. That's why we are still entangling with their mechanisms and what you call mechanisms and strategies. On the other hand, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where again 250 to 500 people were raped alone only. So they supported these survivors with medical and psychological care, with a lot of other NGOs and non-governmental interventions, and also advocated for legal reforms and community-based strategies to combat impunity. That's the second thing that I came across. Apart from that, in Somalia, it's another very complex situation. The mechanism they took to strengthen the grassroots conflict resolution mechanisms were different, little different to the other two cases that I mentioned. But then again, it was pretty much supported by the same stakeholders, not from their own context. So again, the awareness programs and the reduced stigma against survivors in targeted communities and so on and so forth. So this is what I see. Two things, let me put it in this way. I'm not directly answering your question. Instead, I'm like posing you another question for this. One thing is, I still see, despite the advancement made by feminist scholars to this field of study, we still see gender binary in conflict and the crisis situation. At the same time, certain policy initiatives and legal frameworks that we have developed and the mechanisms and the strategies that we have developed, we still see that gender binary. Second thing is, apart from having this gender binary factor, you also see all these are introduced by the Western thinkers. So it's largely Western mechanism, Western thought is largely being entangled in this. It doesn't mean that I openly criticize the Western education or anything as such. Of course, there's so much that we can get. I'm also educated in the same context. I respect the thinking and that academia so much. But we are in a situation that we cannot entirely involve in the continue with the same scenarios anymore. For an example, I'll give you an example. They say that especially the victims who have gone through this rape and other different types of gender-related violent activities, you have to give them a psychosocial mechanisms. So I was wondering, what does that mean? What do you mean by psychosocial mechanism? So it has to be addressed properly. You are bringing so many concepts, so many theories, so many policies, and it's you have to deconstruct it now. So this is why I say that first you have to identify the human nature, first of all. If I'm to give an example, how we are going to make them aware from the grassroots level to overcome these kind of atrocities. First, I would say this is for the two scenarios I'm taking here. One scenario is post-conflict scenario, and the other scenario is pre-conflict scenarios. So if you take both these scenarios, what we have to first identify, we have to bring in a new social contract, and it is very timely, it is very timely. And we still don't see that because we are still largely entangled and we still worship Western thinking and Western theology and Western theories and treat them as gospel. We have completely excluded and are oblivious of our own thinking and what we can bring into these kind of situations. So what I want to emphasize here, first of all, humanity should be recognized as one common entity. Diversity and ethnic, religious, cultural, class, racial diversities are inevitable, just like conflict and war, just like violence. Those are inevitable. That will revolve and evolve with humans. But at the same time, those socially constructed and language and culturally constructed concept, you have to recognize it. You have to protect it through legal means. At the same time, you have to make them aware that human falls into the same one category as human. It's one human category. You cannot segregate them like we do for plants and what we do for animals. While doing so, while taking that concept and idea into our legal systems, making people aware of that, you also have to make people aware this distinction. You have to overcome this distinction. But not my perception here is not similar to the contemporary feminist perception. But I do have a different perception. This is, I believe that when it comes to male and female, it's just that it's an identity differentiation. There are some males who are masculine, are very strong, and there are also some women who are equally the same. But mentally, there can be women who are more strong, and there are males who are mentally strong as well. So this is something that what you have to understand it, despite the certain socially constructed role given by these two groups, at the same time you have to believe that despite the sexual difference, the gender difference, there's no much of difference when it comes to humanity, including male and female. So this gender binary has also have to be taken to a sort of different interpretation. And this was there in our Eastern thinking. And the third one is women should be made aware that they can play a sort of a dominant role in the conflict and the crisis situation equally. They are not just like they are combatants, and the soldiers and who bring the victory to the country are not only confined to males and soldiers. Of course, as I said earlier, women also can have a role to play. So these things should go simultaneously while incorporating certain mechanism. With the mechanism, as I mentioned earlier, it has to include not only social aspects, it also should include medical, physical, mechanical, social, cultural, and legal aspects. All these things, it should be a hybrid, holistic approach should be taken to find new mechanism for this contemporary violence in the world. I directly didn't answer your question. Instead, I gave my own perception related to the same. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Anuradha. Actually, you have already covered the areas of the questions I was about to ask from you as well. So it was a very comprehensive answer. So on behalf of everyone, I would like to extend our sincere gratitude to Dr. Anuradha Rodrigo for sharing such valuable insights today. And it's truly amazing, and it was very, very informative. So, and also a heartfelt thank goes to our audience for their active participation today, and as well as participants who are going to watch our YouTube session as well. So, and with regard to our participants today, we hope to have your engaging questions for the Q&A session as well. And lastly, I would like to give my sincere thanks to our coordinators for their hard work and organizing this successful event, because without their efforts behind this scene, this wouldn't have been a successful and impactful session. So thank you everyone for joining us today. So this brings our live session to a close, but we invite you to stay tuned as we continue